I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News in Focus. This week, we're putting Arctic sovereignty in focus. In between talks of tariffs and trade wars, there's another foreign policy issue making headlines this federal election.
We are building new military installations and increasing the presence of Canadian armed forces in the Arctic to defend our sovereignty, the North, and those who call it home. And since the end of Pierre Poilievre's Conservative government, defense spending has more than doubled. I repeat, defense spending has more than doubled in the last decade, but it's not enough for the new environment we're in. And that's why today I'm announcing my plan to rebuild, reinvest, and rearm. We will expand the capabilities of the Navy with new submarines and additional heavy icebreakers to defend the North. We will deliver an unprecedented acceleration of investment in our armed forces so that we can defend every inch of our sovereign territory while helping to support and defend our allies abroad.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney on March 25th, speaking outside a shipyard in Halifax. If there's one thing the Conservatives and the Liberals agree on, it's the need for more guns, fighter jets, and ships stationed in the Arctic. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is promising to build a base in Iqaluit, and Mark Carney wants 3 across the North. It's all in the name of protecting Canada's sovereignty against foreign nations. But with such a vast amount of territory, is that even possible? And how will this impact Inuit, who call the Arctic home? To help us figure that out, I'm joined by David Pugliese, an investigative journalist with the Ottawa Citizen, who's considered one of the foremost journalists on military issues in Canada. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, can you tell us a bit about what this concept of Arctic sovereignty means?
Well, for the Canadian government, when they talk about Arctic sovereignty, there's a lot of emphasis on the military presence or surveillance or patrolling of the far north and the Arctic. But as well, Arctic sovereignty also includes the individuals who live in the Arctic and the various communities, and those individuals being, the face of sovereignty, Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic for government and for this country.
And can you give us a bit of an overview of what the Conservatives and Liberals are promising when it comes to militarizing the Arctic?
Sure. So there's all kinds of promises, and I would emphasize at this point, their promises, because over the course of the last couple of decades that I've been, covering this type of thing, a lot of promises have been made and a lot of promises have never materialized. So the Conservatives are talking about expanding the Canadian Rangers. That's the local force in the Arctic. It's a reserve military unit. They're also talking about establishing a permanent base in the Arctic, and they're talking about increasing the number of icebreakers and ships that are capable of operating in the far north. The Liberals are much similar promises. Again, the Prime Minister or the Liberal leader, Mark Carney, has announced, committing to more icebreakers, more ships, more of a permanent presence in the Arctic again. So they both have very, very similar promises.
Yeah, and so, we hear a lot from leaders and candidates about, what their plans are for Arctic sovereignty. But I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, how this is impacting people that live in the North.
Well, so if these promises go through, they're certainly going to impact people in the North, because there'll be more construction, if bases are established, for instance. So a permanent base is going to mean military personnel in the Arctic, in the far north. You're going to have a lot more construction as these bases are built. You're going to have again, if the promises are kept, more icebreaker traffic. And then, as the Conservatives have said, they're going to increase the number of Canadian Rangers. Whether they can recruit more Canadian Rangers is open to questions, but yeah, so you're going to see more presence in the Arctic.
And I guess, in these talks and with these announcements, has there been any talk of, including Inuit in these discussions and, including their voices as well?
Well, Mr. Poilievre ran into some criticism when he announced his Arctic base, and he didn't consult with local governments or local individuals. Mr. Carney, when he went up to make some of his announcements, did have local government representatives and such. So, but again, both whoever forms the next government is going to have to work closely with local government and local inhabitants, because they're the people who live in that region, and they have the greatest stake because of that.
So, back in the Cold War era, North American forces established the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, to detect threats. Do you think we're going back to sort of those days?
I mean, there are going to be increased surveillance systems put into the Arctic. There's a couple of programs underway, one called the Over the Horizon radar. Now, that's going to be situated in southern Ontario, but it's going to be looking over the Arctic to see incoming threats, whether it's aircraft, whether it's ships, whether it's missiles. Another program that is supposed to be established is called the Polar Over the Horizon radar, and that's going to be an actual radar system that is put into the far north, and that will be more technology, a greater technology than the old DEW line.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, what are some tangible things that Canada might actually do to protect the Arctic against foreign powers?
Well, it's interesting in the sense that there's a lot of emphasis on military capabilities, but in many ways, sovereignty is best represented by the people that live in the region. And as we've seen, there are infrastructure problems. Whether it's drinkable water, or whether it's proper health care, that type of thing, and that is a major component, or should be a major component, of Arctic sovereignty, taking care of the inhabitants of this region, because they're your eyes and ears, and they're your presence in Arctic sovereignty, or to project Arctic sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. And in a similar vein to that, how are leaders sort of talking about, Arctic sovereignty with Canada, but then also Indigenous sovereignty for people in the North? Is there any conversation sort of about those two things in tandem with each other?
Well, there's the Liberal government, or the Liberals, promised to include Indigenous populations, in almost every avenue, and I believe the Conservatives have said that as well, and that's a priority, or that should be a priority. Whether going forward, whether that takes place is another matter. When Liberal leader Carney was up north to make his announcements, for instance, he made an announcement about this over-the-horizon radar, but he also at the same time announced a bunch of infrastructure and other improvements for northern communities. So I think going forward, those types of programs are going to have to be tied to sovereignty initiatives and military sovereignty initiatives.
there anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know or pay attention to on this topic of Arctic sovereignty with a federal election coming up?
I think the key is whether, to watch for is whether these promises are kept. Because, I wrote an article about the Nanisivik military base or fuel depot that was being built. And that originally started as a deep water port. And it was, and then it was scaled down over the years. It was announced in 2012 and it's still not open. We're in, 2025 and they don't have a date of when that's going to be open. So I think that, people or politicians make a lot of promises. The Canadian Rangers, expanding the Canadian Rangers is a good example. But, 2 years ago, I did an article about the Canadian Rangers weren't getting paid for the fuel they use. They use their own snowmobiles for patrols and such. And they're having trouble getting paid reimbursed by the government for fuel. So when you've got, situations like that, I think you have to closely look at whether these promises are going to be kept.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, David.
Thank you.
David Pugliese is a journalist with the Ottawa Citizen.
Hey guys, it's Shady Vance, the Vice President, and there was so much excitement around Usha's visit to Greenland this Friday that I decided that I didn't want her to have all that fun by herself, and so I'm going to join her. I'm going to visit some of our guardians in the Space Force on the northwest coast of Greenland, and also just check out what's going on with the security there of Greenland. As you know, it's really important. A lot of other countries have threatened Greenland, have threatened to use its territories and its waterways to threaten the United States, to threaten Canada, and of course to threaten the people of Greenland. So we're going to check out how things are going there. And I say that speaking for President Trump, we want to reinvigorate the security of the people of Greenland because we think it's important to protecting the security of the entire world. Unfortunately, leaders in both America and in Denmark, I think, ignored Greenland for far too long. That's been bad for Greenland. It's also been bad for the security of the entire world. We think we can take things in a different direction.
That was U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance talking about Greenland. Since coming into power, the Trump administration has been fixated on taking over the world's largest island to, in their words, protect its citizens. It's a lot like the talk about annexing Canada, which explains the move to take a stand in the Arctic. But Canada's vision of a sovereign Arctic is nothing new to Inuit living in the north. In the 1950s, hundreds of Inuit were relocated to various locations so Canada could tell the world the area was populated. Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay are two of those communities. In late 2023, then APTN correspondent Danielle Paradis traveled to these communities, and she talked to the people there about the climate crisis and being relocated for her podcast, The Place That Thaws. She joins me now. Thanks so much for joining us, Danielle. For listeners who aren't familiar, can you tell us what your podcast, The Place That Thaws, is about?
Yeah, so The Place That Thaws is a look at the high Arctic and the way that both climate and culture are changing. So myself and Trevor Wright, who was a videographer, went up and we talked to residents of the areas about two things. So one, of course, climate change is changing the way that people hunt. It's changing the way, even the times that people go out on the ice. But at the same time, you have things like Starlink that are significantly changing culture, and Inuit are more online than ever. And that's also changed the way that people perceive themselves and Canada.
And so, we're seeing a lot of conversations about Arctic sovereignty. And I'm wondering, when you're up north, were you hearing anything about this concept?
Yeah, because of the high Arctic relocations, which happened in the 1950s, and Inuit families were actually forced/coerced into moving from Inukjuak, which is northern BC, up near Alert, which would be the concept that most Canadians are familiar with, so the North Pole. They were moved into communities like Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay. And that was in part to bolster Canadian sovereignty during the Cold War. So as these families are the legacy of those policies, something like sovereignty is really on their mind. At the same time, you have the presence of military up there as well. And you have many Inuit who are members of the Canadian Rangers. So I spoke with Devin Manick. He's a dog sledder, and he's also a Canadian Ranger. So he spends his time up there doing patrols and also working with Canadians from other parts of the country, Southerners as they call us, to get ready for a war in Arctic conditions if that were to happen. So to train for that. So it's something that's very much on the minds of people that far north.
Yeah, and I guess, given this legacy of forced or coerced relocation, what do people in the North think about this idea of Canadian sovereignty? Is it sort of a complicated thing?
I think it really is different from generation to generation. So a friend I still have from my time up north, Darlu Kigutak, had posted a picture recently talking about the Arctic and how they had hoisted a Canadian flag and that we are Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Larry Adualuk, who's up in Greece Fjord, is also a big proponent of Canadian sovereignty and actually wants to see more attention paid to Canadian sovereignty in areas like the Northwest Passage. Now there's several Northwest Passages due to climate change. So people have concerns. They view themselves as Canadians. They celebrate things like Canada Day. At the same time, they are aware of the difficulties that their families faced by being put up north without proper provisions and by the government just assuming that an Inuit is an Inuit is an Inuit and somebody from northern Quebec would be equipped to handle life up in the north. So there is a complicated legacy. Often younger people are people who are asking more questions about that and asking questions about investment in the north.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, based on what you've seen in the last couple of months, do you think there's been a surge in nationalism in the Arctic?
So as I said about Jarlu Kigutak in his picture, I think that there's more of an awareness of Canadian sovereignty or of the threat to Canadian sovereignty when you have not only Donald Trump making noise about tariffs, but you have concerns about Russia and even Greenland and the ways in which there's questions about sovereignty, either on a country or threats from another country. So I think that you've seen more alertness, which often then correlates to, more Canadian flags, more talking about being Canadian and more identity. So I do think that you have seen a slight surge, but I think that there's always going to be with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, that's going to be balanced with the really real harms of colonialism and the way that we see that ongoing effect in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess, with conversations about Arctic sovereignty emerging more and more, how do you think leaders will need to act to uphold Indigenous sovereignty as well?
Well, firstly, I think we need to hear about it. I am not hearing anything from leaders about Indigenous issues. We've been completely sidelined in these conversations, and most of what's happened in talking about sovereignty has just meant that people are thinking about Canadian sovereignty. So I think, one, we need to see a return to conversations about reconciliation, about the calls to action that we need to, when leaders are visiting the North, be it Nunavut, or high up in the high Arctic, we need to make sure that there are these respectful conversations where we're not just assuming that people are Canadian flagpoles, but people with their own identity and history. So I'd like to see a lot more of that. I'm not seeing any of it right now.
Mm-hmm. And, with that, there have been several visits, with this federal election campaign in the Arctic, talking about Arctic sovereignty and military investment. Do you have an idea of how this has been received?
I think that there's always, people are always happy to see that the North is getting attention because it is an area that not a lot of Southerners are familiar with or think about what life is like that high. But at the same time, of course, people are wanting to see investment. So military investment does provide jobs and other opportunities, same way that mining does up in the North. But what about just general social investment and social infrastructure to make sure that the cultures and communities are strong and healthy? I think people still want to see a push for that, and it's just not the conversations that the leaders are having when they go up north. It's mostly been about militarization.
So what do you think needs to be brought into that conversation more?
I think, communicating with elders, sitting with people, which is something that governments have done in the past, but with our current focus on tariffs and prices and the Canadian market, we haven't necessarily seen that ongoing relationship. And of course, in Canada, we have a nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations. With Inuit, there is a slightly different social infrastructure. There's still the municipalities, so it's a little different. But we have not seen that care and concern for community. We haven't seen any investments into making sure that there's clean drinking water in the north, that there's good schools, and those are all things I think that I'd like to see more attention paid to.
Yeah, before I let you go, Danielle, is there anything else you think is important for our listeners to know about this topic?
Yeah, I think we need to pay attention to the Arctic as territory. So for not only the Inuit, who we've mostly talked about, but the Dene, you have all of these considerations of nation-to-nation relationships. You have treaties, and you have with the prorogation of Parliament, we stopped a lot of the conversations, the treaty negotiations, that kind of thing. So I think the federal government will need to have pressure put on it, whatever federal government we end up with, to make sure that they put Indigenous issues back up on the top of the list.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Danielle. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This episode of In Focus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko, and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. You can find more APTN podcasts, like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics, by visiting aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth in Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.